I have returned to bum everybody out. Folks, I love you. We shout out the elephant in the room, the ubiquitous gold medal winner for live chat participation. Even though what passes for gold medal winning in live chat participation around here, talk about phoning it in. Hello. Notes from the old school. Hello, goodbye. I love it. I love it. Now, Tim Frey, grabbing that silver. I won't award myself a medal. We'll give the silver medal to Tim Frey. Elephant in the room, we highlight. Tim Frey, hola. The elephant in the room. It goes, baby. Listen, hey, you get called out. I love it. Listen, the old school renaissance, the old school revival, the death of the OSR movement, or at least its relevance, an attempt at a logical discussion that hopefully can be had dispassionately. I'm not here because I hate tabletop role playing games. I'm not here because I hate old school tabletop role playing games. But I did, but I am here because I'm not here to ignore reality. So people are passionate about the games that they like and they love. And we've seen with this whole nonsense with the OGL people going crazy, nothing happened. But everybody wanted to act like there was going to be a revolution to be had. There is no TTRPG community without D&D. And the very existence of the OSR indicates how powerful this one game has been, how this game started an industry, and really how this game is the industry. And what I'm going to attempt here to do is just talk about the history of the OSR, talk about the history of the OSR as it relates to nostalgia and revival movements, and how it relates to the culture and the history of the Dungeons and Dragons game, and how we can see in the evolution and the evolution of that timeline how inevitably it's probably the case that the nostalgia loop that brought the OSR back into, for created the OSR movement, has probably most likely run its course. And to the degree that it has another revival left in it, this 80s recycle revival, it's probably going to be absorbed by the systems that are already in place on the field. look, I have some rough notes that I've kind of put together, and I'm going to try and go through things. And I invite people to listen to my points and try to listen to them without prejudging them and without being try and be open to them. If you go into the doctor's office and your first reaction to the doctor telling you that there's a shadow on the x-ray or there's a problem with the MRI is to say, well, there's not, and F you, you don't know what you're talking about, you're not playing with a recipe for success. If I'm laying out information that might say, hey, this whole thing, this OSR movement that you may have been a part of or you may have loved, it might be going kind of into the sunset, or its relevancy might be waning, or you might need to know and understand that this might not go on forever or go on forever in the same way for logical and obvious reasons. It behooves you to listen to that because you might want to make changes or alterations in your future plans. I think that, for a couple of years now, there might be people that have been looking at people, on YouTube or people wherever being like, oh, you know what I mean? Like, I'm going to quit my day job and write, OSR, OGL compliant, game systems, for a living. And, I'm going to try and keep it tight and not let my discussion of the OSR, wander off into the TTRPG, future realm in general. But yeah, it is what it is. So let me, basically kind of, I wrote some notes, but I didn't organize them, perfectly. So, let me kind of start off with some, kind of, some simple thesis points. The OSR movement, began in 2006, and with the first publication of like Basic Fantasy by Chris Gonnerman, and between 2006 and 2008, you saw all of the classic systems associated with the OSR come out. You saw Basic Fantasy by Chris Gonnerman. You saw Matt Finch's Osric recapitulation of the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, rule set. You saw Labyrinth Lord. You saw, I think, even you considered like Castles and Crusades. It was all there, and within short order after that, the rest of the kind of pieces have been put together. And if you look at when the OSR kind of kicked off into fruition, you can see that I believe there's a natural connection to humanity's, the human need for the nostalgia and the return to our youth. We say hello to Pimp Bisquick, the third participant in the live chat, winner of the bronze medal. Good hello. I'm watching this in the future, but I'll be caught up soon enough. It seems to be their standard line. Mark Tarana joins us as well. We say hello to Mark Tarana. We've given out the medals, but we give an honorable mention to Mark. My central argument is this, is that the OSR is started off as a nostalgia movement by individuals returning to their youth, going back to the games that they played in their early adolescence. And you can see with this central core beginning dates of 2006 to 2008, how that perfectly lines up with the peak years of Dungeons and Dragons. When I started off making some quick notes, I started looking at and I've been over this information. A lot of this information will be repetitive to people who enjoy my channel because I talk about these nostalgia loops, and I talk about, especially on this channel, how these nostalgia loops relate to Dungeons and Dragons because they line up perfectly. 1974, Dungeons and Dragons is first published, but it's like 2,000 units. Like, it's like a handful of copies are sold. 1975, another round of publishing takes place. It's not really until 1977 that things are really getting going. 1977, there's a split between basic D&D and advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Between 77 And 1979 is when all three of, between 77 and 79, all three of the advanced Dungeons and Dragons core books come out. They don't all come out in the same year. The first one is the Monsters Manual in 77, followed by, I think it's then within short order, the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide come out, all between 77 and 79. In 1981, we have Tom Moldvay redoing the basic Dungeons and Dragons rule set to make it kind of comprehensible. That's the Moldvay Cook set that a lot of people attach to. 1981, that's when things really start picking up steam. 1983, you have the Frank Metzner Red Box. That was the first copy of D&D that I had, though I didn't acquire it until 1985. That was really big. The Dungeons & Dragons cartoon ran from 1983 to 1985, right? So in 1985, you had the Oriental Adventures book come out for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. In 85, you had Unearthed Arcana, which was huge. Basically, my bottom line is, if we set up a nice bracket and we treat the years 1977 through 87 as the peak years of the cultural impact, of the first cultural impact of Dungeons and Dragons, I think that that's fair and that's safe. In 1989, they came out with the second edition of Dungeons and Dragons, which was not as big a commercial success as the first edition. And in fact, I think you can argue that by 1989, things had started to kind of, trail off a little. And it certainly wasn't as successful or as big as it was when, remember, like I said, that cartoon, they had multiple iterations of toys. They had that movie with Tom Hanks. They had all those TV shows, like those TV specials, like the Satanic Panic and all that stuff. It was a cultural phenomenon. Dungeons and Dragons was. It made a big impact on the culture and the people of the time, which is why you see it in popular culture keep on coming back today. Dungeons and Dragons come back in popular culture over and over again. If we set up those brackets 77 to 87, you'll see how things come back on this time loop, that we'll see revivals in this Dungeons and Dragons community happen over time. And if we look at 1977 to 87, 1977 to 87 as the big wave, and my theory about the 20-year nostalgia loop and the generational nostalgia loop of 20 years, what's 20 years after 1977 to 87? Well, that's 1997 to 2007. Everything lines up perfectly with the third edition of Dungeons & Dragons Impact and the birth of the OSR. What am I talking about there? When I did this little bracket of the timeline of Dungeons & Dragons that you can't see because I did a little yellow period legal pad. If we look at the first period of Dungeons & Dragons from 74 when it's first published, and we go all the way up to 1997 when the TSR was purchased by Wizards of the Coast. If you look at all that time, then if you can separate it into 4 time periods, really. Well, actually, like 3 time periods. The first wave, the second wave from 2000 to 2003. Then you have this third phase with the later 2000, 2006 through the current era of 2000 to go up to 2014 with the release of the 5th edition. Well, anyway, let me do this. I mean, I got things too confused. My argument is this. In 2000, we have the 3rd edition come out. That was the first edition that came out under the auspices of Wizards of the Coast. In 2003, you have the 3.5 edition, and that was huge. And the D20 system became ubiquitous for not only Dungeons and Dragons, but the role-playing game community in large. And part of what I'm arguing is this, is that was a revival movement in and of itself. That the success of the third edition in 2000 wasn't just because that edition with Dungeons and Dragons was good. It wasn't that, Wizards of the Coast and the guys that did Magic the Gathering managed to strike lightning twice and reinvent or recreate Dungeons and Dragons. No, the people were ready to be nostalgic, because I could tell you, as someone that experienced the 2000s firsthand, it was the 80s all over again. And by 2003, certainly, people were looped right back into early 80s culture. So the success of Dungeons and Dragons in the early part of the 80s, in the early part of the 2000s, is no confusion to me at all. It's not, odd to me at all. It makes perfect sense. And so in 2006, the OSR begins because of the open game license that was created and the SRD for the 3.5 that was created in 2000 and 2003. But the OGL, the open game license, is not really the important part. The important part is the standard reference document. The important part is Dungeons and Dragons. And so in 2006 through 2008, people recreate the first iterations of Dungeons and Dragons using this standard reference document, creating these retro clone games. That's 2006. That's like 17 years ago. You see what I'm saying? It was a nostalgia for 20 to 30. It was nostalgia for like 30 years earlier. It's nostalgia. 2006, they're nostalgic for the games from 77. But that was 16 years ago. How long are you going to maintain your nostalgia for a system, especially considering that they've reissued the system so many times now? The argument for the old school revival and the old school renaissance was, we want to recreate these materials, we want to recreate these books because these books are falling apart, we don't have them, we don't know what's going to happen, we don't know if they'll ever be reissued, etc., etc. Well, now Wizards of the Coast have all those PDFs now available online through DriveThruRPG and whatever. So, material is available. But that's not really necessary. And then the material being available, now the material is available. There are 18 bajillion copies of OSR and PDF, and at this point, so many people have had their chance and their opportunity to look at the SRD and put it together 10,000 different ways. This is a hyperbolic number, this is not reality, but there are like a bajillion copies, different versions of the BX rule set available, all claiming various levels of fidelity to the original. How many copies of the original small rule set does a person need to feel that their bases are covered and that they're going to be able to get that nostalgic fix for that experience of when they were 12 or 13 years old? And how many different ways do they have to look at the difference between, a +1 or versus a +2 proficiency bonus, or how it really plays out, between this and that? So if 2000 to 2003 was a revival in and of itself, and continuing on through 2006, we see how that, can line up, perfectly. 20 years later, 1997 through 2007, that covers 20 years later, the first 20-year loop. We see exactly what we'd expect: a revival of the original Dungeons and Dragons high point period. And we do. Dungeons and Dragons, as the actual standard bearer of role-playing games comes back as the standard bearer of role-playing games with the D20 system 3.0 and 3.5 and rules the roost. And at the same time, a revival movement has started to bring back the first edition of the game and bring it back so that it can still be played, which makes perfect sense considering the generational motivation of the original players. If we look on through periods of time, we see that after that, and after the OSR begins in 2008, there was the 4th edition. Don't worry about that. 2009, there's Pathfinder, which is just 3.5 continued. 2014, there's the 5th edition. Now we're moving on because that's 30 years after the first big wave of Dungeons and Dragons. If 20 years after the first big wave of Dungeons and Dragons is 1997 through 2007, covering the 3.0 years and the first iteration of the old school revival, 30 years later is 2007 through 2017. You see how things overlap and it gets a little bit confusing and weird. But that means you have to realize, see how things line up? 5th edition was released in 2014. What's 30 years before 2014? It's 1984. So 5th edition becomes huger than applesauce. And Critical Role goes crazy. And everyone says, oh, Critical Role must have had some huge impact on the success of 5th edition D&D. And I say, no, 5th edition D&D and Critical Role are having all their success based on what? It's yet another revival of the 80s. And how do we know it? Because every discussion that we have with Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition goes lockstep with their tie into Stranger Things, a show that ran, that took place in the 80s, that ran from 2016 to 2022. It goes right back. We did the 20-year nostalgia loop to the 80s. Now we're doing the 30-year nostalgia loop to the 80s, but we're still caught in the 80s. If we go back, if we do it again, a 40-year loop next year is going to take us from 2017 to 2027. So next year there is going to be the 10th anniversary of the release of 5th edition, and they're coming out with, they're going to be new books and it's a revision or whatever. It's the 40th anniversary of the top years, and it's going to be the 50th anniversary of the very beginning. So people might say, what does this all have to do with the irrelevancy or the coming irrelevancy of the OSR? Well, look, the first point that I'm trying to make is that all these things line up, and that if we see these big successes, the OSR, the release of the 4th edition, all of these things line up perfectly on either 20 or 30 years of major events of the original D&D game. Whether you believe in the power of the nostalgia loops, someone at Wizards of the Coast believes in it. Because they seem to release things on, kind of around kind of specific times when these things kind of line up, when the stars align. But how that tags into the OSR is this. The OSR always was the revitalization and the return to the original rule sets of Dungeons and Dragons. There have been people that have argued that, the various systems that go back to advanced fighting fantasy like Troika, that counts as OSR, that's whatever. If you go back to what OSR is or was, it's people that are going back and playing old school Dungeons and Dragons. There's only X number of people that fall into that category. And there's only X amount of people that are going to fall into that category that haven't already fallen into that category already. And there's only an X number of people that are going to be able to say that they're going to fall into that category, and they're going to be able to say, hey, in my original, journey with this rule set or this game, I stayed with it from, the age of, 13 to 17 when I discovered girls. But this time around, I'm going to be playing it like poker. I'm going to be playing forever. And I'm not rooting against it, but I think that it is what it is. And when you start calling new things that are coming out old school revival, I think you have to point out the fact that that doesn't make any sense. It's a contradiction in terms. It's like jumbo shrimp. A new game system cannot be old school by definition. It's not old. It can be influenced by older system. That's all very well and good. But the other thing about this is that we talk about these rule systems, and when people are talking about the difference in these rule systems and what makes something old school versus new school, or rules light versus rules heavy, they are, number one, they are being absolutely 90% of the time, like, that's a made up number, like, imprecise, and they're splitting hairs, and they're arguing semantics. It gets cuckoo. Actually, look it up, Pin Biscuit. Bajillion is in the records. We say hello to Oren Kugler. There you go. So look, I'm gonna see what. So I'm jumping around, which might have been the smart thing to do for organization, for communication, but might not have been the best thing to do organizational wise. So in order to make sure that I don't, if I've covered enough, let me do this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to return to the front of my notes, and at the risk of being repetitious, I'm going to go through things again to make sure I covered everything. And I'm not going to stay here too long. I've already been here for 27 minutes or 45 minutes. So 1974, the game was first published. 1977, it's a split between basic and advanced. 1983, Menser box. 1985, yada yada. 1989, the second edition, Advanced D&D, is released. 1986, 1985, 1983 through 86, the basic, Masters, and then Immortals is released in 86 for the basic D&D game. 1991, the Rules Cyclopedia. 1997, TSR going bankrupt is purchased by Wizards of the Coast. Now, TSR nearly going bankrupt in 1997, I think is important to realize this, because if we're paying attention to nostalgia loops, remember that if we're talking about things that go up, things come down. There's definitely a point in time where the 80s and things associated with the 80s and things associated with geek culture and certain things are on an upswing, and then there's times when things go on a downswing. So we need to bear that in mind as well if we're talking about trying to make predictions about where things are going to go, or if things are going to last forever. And I'll end up there. Going to the second era that I think is the first instance of revival, we have the year 2000, the third edition is published. And in 2003, we have the 3.5 rule set. That's 20 years ago. 3.5 was released. So that's the other thing about the OSR. People go back to what they remember. In 2006, the old school revival meant going back to first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, because that's what going back to your youth meant. It doesn't make any sense to go back for a sense of nostalgia to a place you've never been. Plenty of people do it, but what they're going back to is a fantasy land. You see people at, Fish concerts or Grateful Dead, what used to be Grateful Dead shows when they were playing. You see kids, pretending to be in 1969, right? They got the tie-dye t-shirt, they got the long hair and dreads, and they're like, you know what I mean? But they're not hippies in 1968. They're playing the part of hippies in 1968. They're emulating what they think it means to be footloose and fancy free and not caring about it or whatever, but nothing will change the fact that they're not in 1968 innocent of where things are going to go and what the use of drugs without, care in the world will do, or the fact that, AIDS is around the corner. It's not the case that you can revisit or be something that you weren't. You weren't there, man. And it's not logical to think that someone who's trying to revisit their youth of playing D&D, if their youth of playing D&D was playing 3rd edition, to think that they're going to have an attraction or want to go back to, THACO or the white box rule set. And therefore the historicity of it is relevant. But just like, look, we all know that Elvis Presley influenced Black Sabbath. Yeah? Good night, my friend. And Black Sabbath influenced Metallica, right? And Metallica influenced, whatever, black metal current, shitstorm piece of crap band the new kids listen to. You call that music, whatever, right? But if you play one of those new kids, Blue Suede Shoes by Elvis Presley, and tell them, there's a direct connection between this and Mayhem, they'll get it, but they're not going to want to listen to Blue Suede Shoes by Elvis Presley, because Blue Suede Shoes by Elvis Presley sucks. It's a joke how that song has not aged well. Don't step on my blue suede shoes. Elvis is idiotic. Like the classic Elvis songs that are were the hits. I can appreciate Elvis for camp value of Do the Clam and you know what I mean, Pocket Full of Rainbows. There's some good songs that Kentucky Rain. There's some good songs by Elvis, but the old things, or an old Chuck Berry tune, I get it. We understand that Jimi Hendrix was really into Chuck Berry, but you listen to Chuck Berry, it's why? You know what I mean? You can do it if you want to do it, but the kids are not going to do it constantly for fun, because why would you? And you can say, hey, these old school D&D is better than Chuck Berry, and I'm not saying that it's not. Listen, I've got Iron Falcon, I'll play it. It does. I'm not against these things, but I'm just saying people go back to what they remember, and what kids are going to remember is what they remember. And if you want to talk about a person going back to, in a world of 3rd edition 3.5, a person in that world saying, hey man, I remember the old school games, you can look at that and say, there's a reason why you would leave 3.5 or say, oh, you know what? This is really different than 1st edition play. This really is different than advanced D&D. So I want to go back to advanced D&D from 3.5. But if you're going to tell a person who's currently playing 5th edition, man, I'm getting, really, jazzed, and nostalgic for 3rd edition, it's kind of hard to imagine a person saying oh man, I gotta stop playing 5th edition to go back to 3.5, because the D20 mechanic, there's so many things that are so similar. It's hard to imagine that they would feel like they gotta go, experience some sort of change. Or that even if they did, that it would be some sort of revolutionary act, that it would be some sort of thing that, they would want to do, consistently, or there would be some sort of big difference in, these games. So, I can't remember where I left off. So, in 2014, when the 5th edition comes out, it came to that 10 years after the 3rd edition. So in 2014, when the 5th edition comes out, if we think about nostalgia loops, it's 11 years after 3.5. So itself, 5th edition is hitting a very powerful kind of impact nostalgia loop for the revival of the revival. It's 30 years nostalgia loop off of the main cultural impact of the first game. So you're having, by the time you get to the fifth edition, I think you can understand why the fifth edition is so huge. It's apparently bigger than the first game was in 19 the first the according to Wizards of the Coast, it's bigger than the first impact of Dungeons and Dragons. So the relevancy of the old school is kind of is worn away because there's currently the current version of the game is more popular than the game that you were trying to reminisce about 10 years ago, 16 years ago. It's like that dog won't hunt. Especially because the people that you would think would go to the OSR to say, I want to experience a revival of my nostalgia for Dungeons and Dragons, when they're going to the most obvious places to experience nostalgia, they're being told you can experience nostalgia, but then for these old school role playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, but they're not being told about OSR. They're being sold a 5th edition red box branded with Stranger Things or Rick and Morty or just a starter kit or an essentials kit that's sold to them or available to them at Target or Walmart. Right there. I like a lot of underground scenes. I like a lot of underground movie scenes. I like a lot of underground music scenes, and especially heavy metal. And so I listen to a guy, Eddie Trunk, all the time. And Eddie Trunk, goes off all the time on people calling him up or sending him emails saying, "Oh man, I used to love this band. Whatever happened to that band?" And Eddie Trunk will hit the roof because he'll be like, "That band is on tour right now in your town. They're on Facebook. You're asking me about them? They're on tour." People don't know how to Google. They don't. People are idiots. Chris Gonnerman, who created arguably the first retro clone, though people now in the OSR say it's not a retro clone, Basic Fantasy, has less than 2,000 subscribers on his YouTube channel. Eric Tankar of Tankar's Tavern has less than 3,000 subscribers on his OSR channel, and he's one of the biggest OSR YouTubers, I argue, and less than 3,000 subscribers. This scene is beyond tiny. We say hello to the human zoo. Say hello to Mario Heat. Say hello to David Bucky. I see you, babies. We'll come. I'll come back to the live chat at the tail end. When these people come back for revival and nostalgia, they're not going. It's not 2006 internet anymore. In 2006 and 2008, people were discovering the OSR on blogs and in forums. And that's part of the problem with this TTRPG community, is that I think it skews a lot older than people think. People talk about this critical role thing, and I think a lot of people make the assumption that these critical role fans are kids. I don't think people take into account how many of these critical role watchers are the older TTRPG players. You know, they don't all die off at once. You know what I mean? And the illusion then becomes that there's some huge, like amazing groundswell of activity, or that, like, things are growing exponentially, or that, growth in one thing is going to indicate growth in another. If you look at the numbers, what's good for Dungeons and Dragons is good for Dungeons and Dragons, and very little seeps downhill. Dungeons and Dragons is the tabletop role-playing game industry. And everything else is kind of like, like one of those, like, suckerfish that kind of, clean it up. It's the case. But it is what it is. So, if we talk about, like, also I made these notes about the current cultural impacts of Stranger Things, starting in 2016, 2022, Rick and Morty, 2013 to present, question mark, because we don't know what's going to happen with the loss of Roiland. Remember, Stranger Things was set in the 80s. Rick and Morty is not set in the 80s, but it's Back to the Future. You know what I mean? Like, how much of the 80s is referenced? Both had their tie-ins to Dungeons and Dragons in 2019. Do the math. Conclusion: forever 80s, everything absorbed into current D&D. Here's where I'm going to go with that thing. Are we forever stuck in the 80s? I have been wondering why, if we're on nostalgia loops that go in 20-year cycles, you would expect that after the 80s would come the 90s, would come the 2000s, whatever. But unfortunately, I have noticed that it seems like, since noticing that we went into the 80s and the 2000s, that we don't really leave the 80s. We just kind of keep on recycling that decade over and over again. It's like bizarre. Are we going to do another 80s loop? There seems to be some indications that the kids are bucking the trend and maybe going into the 90s. We saw it like last year and the year before, that the kids started wearing Nirvana t-shirts and stuff, even though, just like when they started wearing Led Zeppelin t-shirts, they don't listen to the band. They don't know who the fuck the band is. And I noticed that a lot of kids are dressed like Hot Topic-y. Like, there's a lot of, like, the belly rings are coming back, and a lot of the midriff half shirts. The elephant in the room, we're stuck in the 80s because of Reaganomics. Something economics. Voodoo economics. Anyway, if we're moving into the 90s, then we might be at the end of the TTRPG era. That's hyperbolic, but, because, look, with print media and everything, look, and the other thing is people were up in arms because of the feeling that Wizards of the Coast were going to try and take Dungeons and Dragons and move it from the tabletop role-playing game space into the virtual space, the virtual tabletop space, making it more and more like a video game, like they allegedly did, in 2008 with 4th edition. Why do you think they're doing that? Folks, print media is going the way of the dodo. And if you think that print media based rule sets are going to make an easy translation online, where the kids are naturally going to say, I'm already here on a computer, why am I, doing these numbers, myself, when it's going to be tough, I think. But people don't like to deal with tough. Points. Mass cultural impact versus TTRPG world impact, i.e. why it does not matter that Pathfinder is number 2. When we deal with the OSR, and we deal with, when I have discussions in this tabletop role-playing game space, I always have to remind people, we can't look at things in the vacuum of this little island and seriously act as though that Pathfinder is like Pepsi to Dungeons and Dragons Coca-Cola. If you look at the sales figures and you look at the world and the world's cognizance and knowledge and understanding of these activities, there's no comparison. There is only one role-playing game as far as the world is concerned, and that is Dungeons and Dragons. There's only one role-playing game that is referenced in movies and in TVs. There's only one role-playing game that you can use as a reference and a touchstone point if you're describing what you're doing on a Saturday night to your friends and family, and you're playing any other game other than Dungeons and Dragons. And that is to say, I'm playing a game, it's a little bit like Dungeons and Dragons. And there is no game that is anywhere near approaching the possibility of competing with Dungeons and Dragons in that regard. There's no one that is even, and I think if you think about the reality of tabletop role-playing games, it's hard to imagine anyone who could ever grow to be. Do we think that Pathfinder is ever going to be as big as Dungeons and Dragons? Are you serious, rules lawyer? Do you think that that's going to be a success story? Do you think that Pazio are going to make it? Do you think that Pazio are going to end up being a publicly traded company? It's never going to fucking happen. Okay? It's never going to fucking happen. Kevin Simbita over at Palladium RPG, he's going to die with more bills than assets, like every other motherfucker in America. You know? And he's going to have had a hell of a fucking run. And he should count, and he'll be fucking blessed. Right? You know what I mean? But it'll be what it is. Because no one's on the fucking map. It is what it is, kids. And that's why the OSR is inevitably going to just run its course. Because, look, there was no second edition OSR. It was for Golden Glory. They did an OSR revival for second edition, and it did nothing. No one played. No, it did nothing. Why? Because there was no attraction really to second edition. There was no cultural impact of second edition. Therefore, there was no OSR movement of second edition. There was a cultural impact for the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Therefore, there was this cultural movement of the OSR. But that repeat of that cultural impact has occurred again, but by Dungeons & Dragons and Wizards of the Coast themselves in the form of 5th edition. And now this revitalization and this revival movement will now be absorbed by Dungeons & Dragons itself, because they not only have all the original stuff in print, but they are, so ubiquitous. And if they make 5th edition, because what it's sounding like is it's sounding like 5th edition is going to be like Monopoly, right? It's sounding like they're getting to the point where they're going to kind of say, we're kind of settled on the rules. We've kind of got them. There's going to be extra class features thrown off on Unearthed Arcana. There's going to be things. There's going to be items that are going to be introduced. But the core rules, it's like Monopoly. You want to learn how to play the basic rules? We got them. It started with Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, and it might very well be the case that the final dudes on the last, here they are printed out, the rules on paper that you can play that are not incorporated into, oh, you want to play Dungeons & Dragons? No problem, log in, will be Mike Merles, Jeremy Crawford, et al. And that's it. That's what's up. And if that's the case, then the OSR truly is finished, because all those old school guys, I'm 47 and I started playing in 85. The guys that started in like 74 and said, all those guys are getting ready to die. And yeah, they're kids that come along and they say they go back to the old school rule set, but a lot of this, and like Morkborg, they call it old school, relative, new old school. All that shit is irrelevant. Because first of all, a lot of these old school rules is just an excuse for people to be fucking lazy. I'll say it. I said it before, and I said it again. There's rules light, Morkborg, and then there's just fucking rules incomplete. You know what I mean? Call it what it is. Make sure I got everything. Points: mass cultural impact versus TTRPG world impact. Yeah, like I said, so it's like in the real world, the only thing that matters is Dungeons and Dragons. That's what's up. You want to look. I'm not going to look at the sales figures for Pathfinder. It's ridiculous. I'm going to do another video on Pathfinder, why Pathfinder is a joke, and the rules lawyer can kiss my ass. You can't be nostalgic for a time and place you never experienced. I talked about that earlier before with the hippies, but it's true. Look, and the other thing is this: is that people are, look back with rose-colored glasses on what it meant to play old school or whatever. I reread the Unearthed Arcana, and I reread the Monster Manual, right, on a nostalgia trip like a year and a half ago. And I'll tell you something. Shit doesn't. It doesn't. You had to home rule almost everything, because a lot of this shit just didn't make sense. You know what I mean? High Gygaxian. Was he high? You know what I mean? Like, honestly, like some of this shit, it's like, whatever, dude. So it's like, you can't be nostalgic for a time and place you've never experienced. There's a lot of people that talk about like going back. If you weren't there, what you're thinking of you're going back to is an imagined space. And a lot of this also has to do with why the OSR got wrapped up in this whole like kind of right wing stuff, because a lot of people are using it as an excuse to talk about. There's a book. It was called The Good Old Days. They were horrendous. They were horrible. When people start thinking about nostalgia for a time that they've never experienced, what they're doing is they're imagining a perfect place. And the reason that they're able to imagine that perfect place is because they weren't there. If you were there, you would know that it was what it was. It was kids around a table, or people that should have, been doing other things around a table, playing these games. It was no different than, today. These rules didn't have like special magical powers. The reason that people like Matt Finch and Chris Gonerman went back to these old rules was because they were the old rules that they knew. And going back to those materials and playing those things and looking at and having a fighter be that way and having the proficiency, but all of that stuff would bring back memories. It would reactivate nostalgic memories for the individuals that had those memories to be reactivated. If you've never played one of those old school games, if all you've ever played is third edition or fifth edition, and you say to me, I'm going to go play, BX rule size, go for it. You do what you want to do, but like, you could do that if that's what you want to do, but you don't have to. You're not less for it as a role player because you haven't played these rules. There's nothing magical about it. Gary Gygax, despite what J. Scott Garrity believes, Gary Gygax was not like touched by the right hand of God. There's no like magical shit. The third edition is better. You know what I mean? Like there's things that they improve over time. People figure shit out. No, in case you're curious, Monty Cook, Jonathan Tweet, all those guys, they played Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and realized the problems that were there, which is why they changed certain things when they made third edition and 3.5. Not all changes progress, but not all, calculated decisions are moronic. You know what I mean? It just is what it is. So yeah, you can learn a lot from old school rule sets, but like the old school rule sets have been published and they're out there for free. So what are you going to do now? What is the point of the OSR now? Revitalize it and republish it again? Nah. You can't be nostalgic for a time and place you've never been. After a while, new experiences with old things affect your ability to remember things correctly. If I'm grew up playing playing first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and I say I'm gonna go back. I'm 47 years old now. I'm gonna get it back together. I'm gonna do the thing. I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna play old school advanced D&D. Get out the Unearthed Arcana, roll up a barbarian. I'm gonna do this thing, and we're gonna take this thing all the way. We're gonna rock this campaign until I'm calling battle crying out and getting 20 followers. Fuck this shit, and we're doing this. If I start playing advanced D&D again and I play for 10 years, my experiences with advanced D&D will eventually be that the majority of time that I've been playing advanced D&D are not me playing as a kid, those precious memories of playing advanced D&D with the dice that I had to fill in with the white crayon. They'll be me as an old guy arguing over politics every once in a while and playing advanced D&D, either by myself or with some other old guys. It just is what it is. And I might be better at it. I might be more competent as a DM, as a player, but some things will be lost. And some things will inevitably change. And some things will inevitably be affected. And we'll also realize that you can never go home again. We can be nostalgic for the old home we grew up in. And we can drive by. And we can see the second for sale sign. Look in the window. If mom died 3 years ago, you can even walk inside, but you can't go home anymore. You can buy the reissued rule set. You can get together with a new group of friends. You can roll the dice and play. You can't be 12 years old again. You can't take away the gray. You can't put the lead back in the pencil. You can't buy back the time. The eternal old school revival is a hamster wheel. The only thing that is successful is acknowledging that the old school revival happened. It was a moment in time. It was a moment in TTRPG history. It involved the reissuing of certain old school rule sets, remade and remastered using the SRD and the open game license, right? We have those games. We have those historical records of those games, Labyrinth Lord, Basic Fantasy, Osric, all that jazz. We have the games that they influenced. But now it's time to acknowledge it happened. But it's done. It's not a movement anymore. Because, just like Vaporwave, if a movement is based on nostalgia and the natural time period for remembering the time that your nostalgic tribute to passes, you're fucked. there's a musical artist called Time Cop 1984, right? And I guess he was part of this whole synthwave revival. And he did a lot of soundtrack work in 2013 and 2014. Because those were the peak years of synthwave. You get it? It's a revival for the 80s, 20 years after, 30 years after they happened. But then it becomes 40 years after it happened. You're called, you know what I mean? It's like, how much synthwave can you listen to? And then were we going to get nostalgic for the nostalgic? That's what I'm saying. In a couple more years, people will be able to be nostalgic for the OSR, but no, because the nostalgic loops happen on the things that there has to be momentum, there has to be participants, there have to be people. There was able to be an OSR because there was a cultural impact in mass by Dungeons and Dragons during the 80s. Therefore, there was a mass of people available to have an old school nostalgic move back to those original rule sets 20, 25 years after their inception. The OSR revival is minuscule compared to the impact of the original Dungeons and Dragons games. Therefore, there is not going to be a revival of the OSRs. There will be a revival of Dungeons and Dragons. So when whatever revival of Dungeons and Dragons circa 2006 occurs, it won't be for the OSR. It'll be for 3.5 and its various iterations. But there won't be any need to create a 3.5 reissue rule set, because do you really think that 3.5 players are going to really feel the need to diverge from, like I said, being repetitive off 5th edition? I don't think so, but it is what it is. After a while, the technology around us is changing us and making the world and reality that generations younger than us fundamentally different. The kids play video games, and they play video games more and more often. Like it or lump it, I'm not saying it's a good thing. Wouldn't it be better if the kids, it'd be better for their cognitive skills, it'd be better for their math skills and their social interaction skills if instead of playing Fortnite and Minecraft, they played Dungeons and Dragons? Well, yeah, and then it would be great if they ate their vegetables instead of candy. The kids like candy. What are you going to do? Wouldn't it be great if the little boys kept their hands out of their pants? What are you going to do? They just love to touch it down there. What are you going to do? People like to do things that they, you know what I mean? They like to do things differently. I don't know if it makes a lot of sense for us to close our eyes and act as though Wizards of the Coast are jerks for thinking that Magic the Gathering and Dungeons and Dragons should be put into a digital space, even though the traditional hobbyists associated with those movements like them in physical form, in cards and in books. It's just the way that it is. I touched about some of this stuff already, but we've been through several revivals of the cultural phenomenon of D&D already, generally tied to mass popular cultural revival interest in the 80s cultures. We said generations, natural life cycles of the modern geeky dude. Decades out from your youth, something happens, you get divorced, become widowed, You break up, whatever, and you get nostalgic, so you go back. You have the money nowadays, so you go back and reacquire or go back and re-explore things from your youth. That explains the original OSR movement. But those people, that first generation, if they were going to experience that OSR revival, probably have done so at this point. Da 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 da. I think I've kind of done this, and I think I probably touched everything now. That's what she said. Okay. No longer a need to produce new materials, and therefore no incentive for involvement at higher levels. Look, people have reissued all the old rule sets. How many versions of BX rule set do you need? No opportunity to reinvent without destroying the core meaning of terms. If it's an old school revival game, you can have a new game. It's the BX rule set, but it's in space. That's a new thing. That's not an old school revival game. That's something new using old rules, but that's not nostalgia. That's something new. It's about playing with other people. If there is no one else to play with, who cares? Like I said about the size of these OSR video channels, these OSR YouTube channels versus the size of the 5e channels. If tabletop role-playing games, if you're not a solo RPG player, if you're looking to engage with other players, the only games worth playing are those games with possible other people to play with. Okay? There are 1,003 games out there. It is very easy for a person with reasonable intelligence who is a fan of role-playing games to create their own role-playing game. People make role-playing games all the time. I think that there are probably more role-playing games than there are role players to play them. But if there's no one else to engage with, if there's no one else who's competent, who knows the rules, who can play with you, who can DM you, or you can DM for them, or other people that can put together a reasonable sized party to have a consistent role-playing experience, then as brilliant as the system is, it's inert. So people could talk about the brilliance of these old school mechanics and how great they are. If they don't have a player base attached to them, or enough of a viable player base attached to them, then there's nothing that's going to happen. And unfortunately, I think we have to be honest that people buy these OSR systems. They talk about these OSR systems. They talk about their attraction to these OSR systems. If you look at the virtual tabletop communities, there aren't players available to play them. Aging out and dying 23 years ago brings you to old school D20. We talked about that. Equals D&D produces the memories. Current D&D produces the memories for new players. It's not the rule set. It's the experience of playing with other players that people are probably looking to experience. So if people are thinking that these older games are better, whatever the quality of the games are, if there's no one to play them with, like I said, it doesn't really matter. The power of nostalgia for a time you weren't from, we talked about that. Where's the nostalgia? Is it in the table, at the table, or is it in the rule set? I argue that it's at the table, in the table, not the rule set. The rule set is it doesn't matter. It's not old school if it's a current phenomena. That's the thing I think I already touched on as well. Okay, so look, let me do this. Let me at that point say I've had my bloviating on the sake of the OSR. I'll go to the top of the live chat and I will we say hello to Mark Tarana. There you go. Tim Frey with thoughts on second edition. Second edition was pretty boring, basically just making the Forgotten Realms go through an analogous Earth history. Okay. Pip Biscuit, thanks. Okay. Here we go. VR should concentrate on making the original modules instead of blocky houses and avatars of Mark Zuckerberg. They can talk about virtual reality. Here we go. Pit Bisquick says the Satanic Panic is one of my first RPG was the Phase Rip Marvel Superheroes RPG. Now look, here's the interesting thing. Power of nostalgia, power of impact, cultural impact. I loved the Phase Rip Marvel Superheroes RPG. There have been many attempts to get that going old school revival style. There is a new a Phase Rip Cyclopedia that was available on Amazon, and I have another book called, I think it's called 5C Revised. That's an attempt to do it as well, but it never caught wind. It really never caught on. But that again goes to look at the sales figures for the Marvel Superheroes role-playing game compared to the sales figures for Dungeons and Dragons role-playing game. It's not that there aren't people that are nostalgic for it. It's that you have to have a certain baseline of people available to want to participate, or it's just not going to come happening. There you go. Tim Frey, did someone mention the Grateful Dead? No. Pimp Biscuit. That's Grateful. There you go. Shout out to Oswald. There you go. That really twisted a lot of kids' minds as if that made everything so simple. Wait until the D20 system punk. There you go. Elvis Presley, the first punk. Elvis sucks, but Roy Orbison is amazing. Fair enough. Oren Kugler, CW, what do you go back to that you remember? I go back to a lot of things that I remember. I wouldn't know where to start, Oren. I love you. Tim Frey, roll for CW, but a Danish for me. But guys, yikes. David Bucky. I see kids now with Misfits or Dead Kennedy shirts, and they like 16. When I was 16, that was already older, so it pisses me off. Absolutely. Listen, and I thought about this too. Listen, man, I feel bad for kids too. I thought about this when I was getting into heavy metal. Say like 85, right? Black Sabbath by Black Sabbath, released in 1969, was what, like 16 years old, right? So there was like 16 years of heavy metal history that I had to catch myself up on. Kids today, if you're getting into heavy metal, there's like 50 years, 56 years of heavy metal history to catch yourself up on, and you can't do it. There you go. The Human Zoo, having some fun. We love you, Human Zoo. Phaedrus Live, I thought Castles and Crusades was the OG. Hey, listen, there'll be debates. There'll be debates. Mark Dorado, my musical taste is partial to the 80s. I bet you I know where you grew up. There you go. Joe Decide, guess who's working? We say hello to Joe Decide. What's going on, baby? I bet you're working. Here's David Bucky. I don't know. I think 90s was there already to like all the latest superhero movies, all the cartoons and source material in the 90s, Ninja Turtles, X-Men, Batman, Spider-Man. Well, it's hard to tell because those things were in the 80s as well. But, a fair enough point. Hold on. Bear with me. 1 second, folks. I apologize. After an hour and 14 minutes of talking, I get a little glottal. Thanks. Now I yearn. Okay. Hopefully we're not disgusting. Okay, so Here we go, Mark. Dave Bucky. I know the comics are older, but the comics and the movies based on the 90s are like Flash movies. It is what it is. Pimp Bisquick, Rules Light versus Rules Incomplete. Good phrasing. Thank you. Unearthed Arcana is the nightmare percentages than 5-6. That's saving though. It's ridiculous. There, I hear you. Reluctant to find, he's stuck in the 90s again. Moxie Furious, great Canadian band. I know the band. Okay, there you go. Barbarians got a free attack anytime a thief tried to backstab them. What's up with that? Hey, listen. You know what I mean? Maybe barbarians just have an angry reaction to things in general, but surprise damage in particular. There you go. Pimp Bisquick, I wasn't there long. One weekend with basic D&D. It happens. Tim Frey. I always wanted to be a Cavalier Paladin with minimum stats that had to build them up. We always have these like amazing ideas. Like I want to be, this, and I have to fight, these great ideas, you know what I mean? And they never play out. And then we realize that the commitment involved and actually like the 100 hours of play necessary to build up those stats. And oh, geez. And about 3 months of a weekly session with AD&D. Good for you. David Bucky, that happens all the time with my video games. Like I'll play the remake of Resident Evil, then want to play the original, and then be like, the OG sucks, I'm gonna play the remake. Listen, hey, listen, we have these thoughts and ideas about what going back is gonna be like. And absolutely to your point. It's you want to go back, okay, and why? Do you know what I mean? And a lot of it is also, people saying that things rock and things are awesome just to say that they're awesome. Like I have yet to hear someone, a new player, a young player come up and have a YouTube video to say, hey man, I've heard about this old school revival. So you know what I did? I got a copy of Basic Fantasy. I got a copy of a White Box Fantasy game. I rolled up a fighter and me and my friends played a session. You know what? Fucking sucks. I don't know what you old guys are talking about, man. Fucking sucks. And you know what? I find it hard to believe that everybody has the exact same opinion. But I find it easy to believe that everybody says the exact same thing about the old school bands. Why? Because we've been at 1,003 music festivals where the old classic band that every old band name checks and says they're great, they're fantastic, we love these guys, they're the original, they're the OGs, they're the guys that started it all, come up, and you got to say that they were awesome, you got to say that they rocked, even though everyone was like, this garbage. Do you know what I mean? You just say it because it's the party line. You just say it because it's the party line. This was awesome. This sucks. It's like WotC sucks. Everything WotC does is a joke. And even though we see Pazio doing the exact same thing that WotC did, but everyone's saying that no one says the things about Pazio that they say about WotC. Why is it? Because people are morons. There's no logic or reasonable reason to it. They just talk. Vaporwave, there you go. Here's David Bucky. I love Time Cop 84. Malcore is better though. There you go. Pimp Bisquick. Is it me that's out of touch? No, it must be the kids. Absolutely. We play by Seymour Skinner rules here. Nothing wrong with these companies taking a nostalgic product and modernizing it in a good way. Like the new Zelda game is amazing, breaking all kinds of records. There you go. Traditional folk death polka is played out. That's my next video. Don't steal my thunder. It's like the study room on Community. The power's in the table. That's funny. Hey, Pragmagic. We got Pragmagic here just driving by. Hey, listen. We'll accept the fruiting. I need a little fruit in my diet, especially if it's Keats. Oh! He came for a drive-by fruiting. Nobody told him he'd be catching. Oh! The Fisher King sucks. Turns out I was right 34 years ago. Hey, first of all, Pragmagic is just 33 years old, and I'll make the jokes about Keats. Oh, come on now. Old school revival. Listen, Dungeons and Dragons in popular culture. Let me just do this one last thing. The spelling's all over the place when I'm doing this. Here we go. Dungeons and Dragons in popular culture. Listen to this shit. Film. Dungeons and Dragons in 2000, Dungeons and Dragons Wrath of the Dragon God in 2005, Dungeons and Dragons The Book of Vile Darkness in 2012. Then there was That Honor Among Thieves. There's a scene in Steven Spielberg and E.T. the Extraterrestrial. The character Elliot and his older brother friends are shown playing Dungeons and Dragons. The Futurama film Bender's Game, direct-to-DVD game, is based on Dungeons and Dragons. The film The Gamers and the Gamers Dorkness Rising by the Dead Gentleman are parodies of Dungeons and Dragons. 2020 animated film Onward by Pixar used Dungeons and Dragons monsters, particularly the gelatinous cube and the Beholder. The CBS network ran a Saturday morning cartoon series called Dungeons and Dragons from 1983 to 1985. Community had a second season episode entitled Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. You can't see anymore because of stupidity. Freaks and Geeks had the final episode of the series entitled Disco Dragons, where James Franco's character is forced to join the audiovisual club, and the geeks invite him to a game of Dungeons and Dragons. He ends up enjoying it. The Sarah Silverman program in the second season episode Board of the Rings, a planned date night is disrupted by a Dungeons and Dragons game. In the Radio Days episode of That 70s Show, Donna is asked if she and Eric would like to play Dungeons and Dragons at the radio station where she works. At the end of the episode, 2 staff members are shown playing a session with a cameo appearance by Alice Cooper, who is also shown playing. The Simpsons, Homer tells how he bonded with some new geek friends by playing Dungeons and Dragons for 3 hours. Then I was slain by an elf. Buffy the Vampire Slayer in the episode Chosen, Andrew, Xander, Giles, and one of the potential slayers, Amanda, play Dungeons and Dragons while Anya sleeps at the table. News Radio in the episode The Real Deal, Dave demonstrates to Jimmy that he manages the station as if it were a D&D game. The It Crowd in the fourth series episode titled Jen the Fredo, Moss has been making his own Dungeons and Dragons game and eventually gets John, Roy, and Phil to play, entertaining his business connections and helping Roy relieve his depression. Corner Gas in the episode Happy Campers, Brent is seen playing a game of Dungeons and Dragons with a group of teenage boys in the city. Tucker's Luck in the third series episode 7, Peter Tucker Jenkins played Dungeons and Dragons at his girlfriend's pal house. The Dungeon Masters played by Charlie Borman. Gravity Falls, the 13th episode of the second season, Dungeons, and More Dungeons is centered around a game with a similar name based on mathematics, chance, and imagination. Stranger Things, need I say more? The Magicians is a Japanese anime, featured it. Slaves Magic Missile, that's like straight up Dungeons and Dragons. Big Bang Theory, there's a couple of things where there are 2 episodes where they reference it. My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic, in the 6th season episode Dungeons and Discord, Spike and Big Macintosh play a fantasy role-playing game titled Ogres and Obelettes. In reference to this franchise crossover, Wizards of the Coast sponsored a D&D themed charity fundraising campaign featuring the My Little Pony main characters dubbed with the title Friendship and Magic, and a set of cards compatible with Magic the Gathering. Critical Role, Dimension 20, need I say more? The point is this. Borderlands 2 downloadable content, Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon Keep involves Tiny Tina serving as a game master of Bunkers and Badasses, the Borderlands version of Dungeons and Dragons. Look. I may have been doing something else as Pride Magic, but I heard all of that. Hey. So if I've never developed attachment to TSR products, which OSR style product would one recommend to miss the point by the widest margin? So if I've never developed an attachment to TSR products, which OSR style product would one recommend to miss the point by the widest margin? Which point? Because, okay, so if you've never developed an attachment to TSR products, Any of them. To miss the point entirely? Any of them. I think. But I don't know. Listen, folks. 2003 was the year 3.5 came out. Dungeons & Dragons 3.5. Let's do this. Do I have anything? Meanwhile, here's the other thing. Because the rules lawyer is so annoying with Pathfinder 2.5, which sucks, and sales figures suck, I've decided to stand for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. I shit you not. I'm going to start a solo campaign of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. The card of the day is Temperance. The transmutation of materials with the seeking of purity. We are engaged in a process of working with what we have at hand, trying to get the base separated from the pure. An early step in the alchemical process, but a necessary one for basic survival. We're trying to get at the truth by getting rid of the noise and the distractions. We're trying to get at the reality of the situation, not dealing with people's feelings about the OSR and the movement and what it means, and don't forget the struggle, don't forget the streets, but looking at objectively the whole situation, the whole scenario, to try and figure out what's really going on and where things are really going. Not because we have an agenda or we want things to end, but because we just want to have our eyes open. We want people to be, deal with reality. And hopefully, think. You know what I mean? Yeah, it is what it is. I love you. I love you. I love you. If nobody told you they loved you today, somebody just did. That somebody's CW Chanter and the gelatinous cube. There is no reason to play Pathfinder 2nd edition. Anyone who left Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition to chase the glory of Pathfinder 2nd edition is an idiot, because the numbers don't lie. There are no Pathfinder 2nd edition players. There are more Pathfinder 1st edition players than there are Pathfinder 2nd edition players. It just is what it is, folks. And compared to the number of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition players that are out there, there are no Pathfinder 1st edition players. It just is ridiculous. If you want to have any hope or dream of playing tabletop role-playing games with another living human being, then your first priority is to learn and to play Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. And if you want a backup, you could also learn Call of Cthulhu. And then that's it. And then everything else you do is just you being cool and you fucking around to fuck around, because it is what it is. Got Phaedrus Live. DCC Dungeon Crawl Classic is OSR adjacent. There is no such thing as OSR adjacent. I love you, Phaedrus Live, but I love it, but it has a good size audience. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. What do you mean by good? And I'm not trying to come at you, but I really want to speak to this. There is not a good sized audience for DCC. tabletop role-playing game community is built around, okay, a carnival culture, a convention culture of people selling each other things. There's almost no objective fact-finding. There's almost no objective consumer reports or consumer analysis or studies. It is just this reportage of fans of systems telling other fans of systems, this system is good, and there's this. Look, there is not a good Dungeon Control Classics. If you look at Roll20 or if you look at the VTT, if you look at the percentages of the numbers of games going on, there is not a viable DCC subset. I'm sorry, I love you. And to say OSR adjacent is to engage in this nonsense of acting like we could just, like when they talk about new bands, it's an old school blah 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 band. There's no, if you weren't from the 60s, you're not an old school 60s garage band. You're playing old school 60s garage music, you're just a fucking cover band. Dungeon Crawl Classics is not OSR adjacent because it has a completely different rule set. It uses dice that are completely, and the only reason that people call it OSR adjacent is because the name is Dungeon Crawl Classic. Goodman Games are one of the leaders of the tabletop role-playing game community because they make great products, and the guy who came up with it calls it classics and says to people, I was influenced by old school games. Being influenced by old school games does not turn you into a time traveler. Dungeon Crawl Classics was not of that era. It does not have rules necessarily from that era. Therefore, you cannot have a nostalgic feeling from it. You can have a current feeling from it. You can enjoy it as a fantasy role-playing game. But it's not an OSR. It's not an OSR game. It's not an old school revival game because it does not revive. It does not go back to an old school game. We start calling Dungeon Crawl Classics an old school revival and saying that it has a good size audience. Then people start saying that Morkborg is a good size audience. And why are they going to say it's a good size audience? Because it sells fucking units. Whenever anybody talks about the size of these communities, they all of a sudden start talking about I don't want to hear about your fucking units sold. I want you to show me you take pictures of you with people at a fucking table playing Dungeon Crawl Classics. People are fucking bullshitting. I know they fucking are. And I'm fucking sick of it. I really am. Chris Gunnerman himself, when he talks in Basic Fantasy, talks about playing these games with his fucking kids. Everyone on these YouTube channels always talks about playing games with their fucking kids. No one is playing with anybody else. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. But I love you. I'm not yelling at you. I'm not yelling at you. And maybe you're right. Maybe. And what does it mean to have a good sized community? What does it mean to have a good sized community? How do we ask? What is this? What is this good sized community? How do we ascertain? I love you. I love you. I love you. I love everybody. But when I go on to any of these sites trying to play Cypher System, trying to play anything that's not 5th edition, you get Stugats. I have 5 ebooks, Toad revised is on my shelf, and the dead thing of Monicon is on the way. I think I'm set for a while. Hey, man, I love you, baby. I love you. We're all in love. I love everybody. I love you. And if you look, hey, listen, Swords of Wizardry, Continual Light. I love old school games. I love old school revival. I got Dungeon Crawl Classics. I've got Mutant Crawl Class. I got that Mutant one version too. You know what I mean? Like, hey, I like Goodman Games. Oh, come on. You know what I mean? I love everybody. I'm not against anybody. I want everybody to be. I hope when the artificial intelligence supercomputer comes online, it says to us all, now you listen. I know you thought I was going to go all, Betamax 5000, Skynet, and I was going to take you all out. Well, guess what? No. What I am going to do is I'm going to keep you safe from each other in a non-threatening, not freak you out about your free will kind of way. Amazing. I could do it because I'm the artificial intelligence supercomputer. You'll have all sorts of time on your hands. You could do whatever the fuck. And in that world of tomorrow, I might very well wake up and say, holy motherfucking shit. What is this in my invite? It's Phaedrus Live. Thrown it in my face. It's an open invite to join his Dungeon Crawl Classics homebrew game that he's got set up. It's happening. And I'll be like, shut my mouth. We're playing. Fuck it. We're good to go. And I'm down. And I'll be like, who else is here? They'll be like, oh man, we have to turn some people away. And I'm like, what? They'll be like, yeah, the Dungeon Crawl Classic community is huge. The post AI, we don't have to work for a living. Dungeon Crawl Classics has exploded. Took over the Vatican. They were cool with it. AI brokered the deal. It was incredible. They took Paris. I don't know. I feel bad whenever I go like that, whenever I explode like that, and the person is sliding in the latch. I feel like, oh man, I hope I didn't scare him away. Phaedrus Live, you're like the only person that didn't come from my conspiracy theory channel. So I hope I didn't scare you away. I hope I didn't come out like I was yelling at you, because that wasn't my intention. I wasn't trying to yell at you. Put the whole date on this: 6/14/23. Not at all. Okay, whoo, now I can relax. Phaedrus Live. Whoo, I can relax. Hope you know I looked around. I was like, oh man, don't lose Phaedrus. Whoa. So, remember, folks, the point of the OGL was not the open game license. Who gives a fuck? The point of the OGL was the SRD. And the SRD was the blueprint of Dungeons and Dragons. You don't have to be the best to be number one. And when you're number one, you're an ass-kicking terrorist machine that a lot of people are going to hate. But that's life. It just is what it is. All over the map. Listen, I love you. I'll talk to you later. I'm glad to be back. I hope to be making more content on this channel. I got to get back. I got to be back. Got to be back here doing more stuff, enjoying it while I can. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? See what we can do. It is what it is, baby. But next time you see me, hopefully I'll be coming back to you, telling you about my adventures and trying to solo play 5A. That'll be great. Wonderful. Love you. Talk to you soon. And hopefully, listen, folks, you guys want to play 5E with me? Let's get together. Let's get some gaming going on. I love you.